Cybersecurity has become one of the greatest challenges facing this country. Last February, President Obama created a commission to address the growing threat. Earlier this month, the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity announced its findings in a comprehensive report. It called for urgent action to enhance American cyber capabilities. Meanwhile, last week, President Obama ordered a full review of Russia's election-related hacking. President-elect Trump continues to dispute the Kremlin's involvement. Joining me now are the Commission's chairs, former IBM CEO Sam Palmisano and former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon. I am pleased to have both of them here. So tell me exactly, briefly, quickly, and then we want to turn to some other contemporary issues and then come back to the report per se, how this came about.
Well, it came about. The president looked at what the challenges were and the things that have been addressed in the first 7 years of his term, and determined that there were a number of challenges that continue. And essentially, Charlie, what this was a preparation of a transition memo for the next president. Jim Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, has the last 3 or 4 years in each of his presentations to the Congress on what the major threats are facing the United States, has ranked cybersecurity number one. And it's just not the case that the country has treated it as the number one threat. We have far more resources and emphasis and mind share and attention to counterterrorism, which is appropriate, and homeland security. But we were, in terms of a whole range of dimensions, really kind of under-focused on the cybersecurity challenge. And there were a number of things that we could do that would enhance cybersecurity, and that's how this commission came about.
And so what did you do, Sam?
Well, basically what we did, and I was honored to serve with Tom as sort of the private sector counterpart to this, and we looked at areas that we were, in the executive order, looked at focus on, primarily kind of in broad terms, the issues around the security of the internet itself. That's identity management, Internet of Things, which is the area, Troy, where now it's no longer your phone or your computer. It's cameras, it's sensors, it's traffic monitors, health devices. All those things now are potentially devices where a hack or some issue could occur. So in addition to that, we were asked to look at government itself, the appropriate systems within government, the processes with government, how government responds to cyber versus counterterrorism and the like. And then we went off and did our work, and international standards and consumer,
So how did you do your work? You went out and you called in every expert you could find, had hearings?
We had hearings across the country. We started in New York with financial services. We did the tech community at Cal Berkeley out on the West Coast. We did the consumer in Minneapolis. We did a couple in Washington. So we had 6 hearings, I think.
Yeah, six hearings.
Is it fair to say most people are vulnerable?
I think most people that are uninformed are vulnerable. So I think if you're aware as a consumer of the technology that you can do things to protect yourself. I think it's very important that everyone understand that there's no 100% solution in today's environment for a cyber threat. And so there's great risk. Now, there are great benefits to the technology, whether it's in economic expansion, commercial terms, enjoyment, personal life kinds of issues, what you do as an individual. But everybody should be sensitive to the fact that there's no 100% technical assurance that this will not happen either to their company or to the individual.
Tom, as National Security Advisor, you dealt with Vladimir Putin, you dealt with the Chinese, you know something about their record with respect to hacking. Talk to me about how you see the crisis that we now face in terms of the president ordering an investigation into whether the Russians hacked and finding out exactly what was done and why. And secondly, Chuck Schumer, John McCain, Jack Reed calling for a congressional investigation. You've got the president wants to investigate while his remaining term in office. You've got Congress saying they want to investigate coming up when they go back in January 3rd, and the new Congress as well. What do you think is going on?
Well, first of all, the investigations are fully appropriate at this point. Last spring and summer, you had some private sector organizations saying that Russian entities, Russian-directed entities, entities that had had long history of association with the Russian intelligence services, were responsible for some of the hacking into the Democratic National Committee and other things. Then you had an extraordinary thing happen in October. The Director of National Intelligence, General Jim Clapper, who represents 17 intelligence agencies in this government, announced publicly that, in fact, that the Russian Federation direct from the government itself, was involved in hacking related to the election. You had Admiral Mike Rogers, the head of the National Security Agency, come out and say that there had
also Cyber Command too.
Yeah, Cyber Command, right? That's right, exactly right. Said at the Wall Street Journal CEO conference recently that in fact that you had a country, and it was clearly Russia, who had interfered and tried to interfere in the election to try to get specific effects. This, though, and the Russians, of course, deny all this. That's and say we don't engage in cyber attacks, we don't engage in election interference. That, of course, is just not true.
Okay.
And my own judgment is that this is again, I've not seen the intelligence that's been the subject of a lot of the debate, but it's a broad matter. There's no doubt that I think that the Russians, based on what we've said publicly, have been involved in trying to interfere with the elections here. And it's part of a broader strategic approach by the Russians, right? This is information warfare. It's just not, espionage happens, right? You know, espionage happens. What happened here is the information was acquired and then it was made public for certain purposes, right? Now, you know, I can't judge the intent, right, with specificity, but clearly some intent was intended with respect to the elections, and it's part of a broader the kind of confrontation that we're having with Putin's Russia.
Okay, so let's just talk about it. So there's no doubt in terms of these intelligence agencies that Clapper is responsible. They report to him and he reports to the president, correct?
Correct.
There's no doubt that in their mind that there was hacking by the Russians.
Right.
Now, what you seem to have today is some difference as to whether the intent was to help Donald Trump's election. Reports in the press say that the FBI has not reached that conclusion, but the CIA has.
Yeah. Well, and again, I don't have any way to judge that at this point, but what is clear, which is why there needs to be an investigation, right? That's exactly the point of this, right? It's an extraordinary thing. A foreign power, in my own judgment, a power that has gone quite hostile to the United States since Putin came back into office in the spring of 2012, has attempted,
perhaps because he saw an opportunity.
Yeah, has attempted to interfere with the elections in the United States, right? And we should find out exactly what happened, what the intentions were, and what the effects were.
John Bolton, for example, who may be Trump appointed to the State Department or somewhere else, former UN ambassador, has said the following. He said, look, when the question came up about whether Hillary Clinton's server had been hacked, it was said, we don't know, but we saw no evidence of it, but the Russians, if they did it, are smart enough now not to leave any evidence. And then he points to what is happening now, and he said, well, look, you know, how are they so sure? Did the Russians leave evidence on one side, but not leave evidence if they hacked on the other side?
Well, again, I don't know the details, but I do know this, right? Is that this is a process that takes into account all manner of information, right? That you have access to, and you put it together in an analytical judgment. And I know quite a bit about the intelligence community. It's not conceivable to me that the Director of National Intelligence would go out and say with high confidence that the Russian Federation has attempted to interfere.
That's what they're saying now.
If they didn't have quite a good case for that. But again, this is why the country needs to know the answer to this question.
And the question is important regardless of what the motive was.
Yes.
Regardless of what the motive was, the question is important.
Yeah,
if they can hack into important government.
Exactly. We're not debating necessarily the outcome of the election here, right? You know, we've had an election, right? And we're going to go forward, but it is important, as Sam said, for the country to know what the vulnerabilities were here, right, from a technical perspective, and it's important from a strategic perspective to know whether or not the Russian Federation, at Vladimir Putin's direction or the direction of his senior people, in a determined way, tried to interfere in the elections.
Not just Russians. I mean, there have been cases in which we believe the Chinese were doing this kind of thing too.
I don't know that we have a case of trying to interfere in an election.
Clearly, you listen to all these experts, and clearly you want to do two things. One, you want to alert America by this report to the dangers of not being prepared with cybersecurity.
Correct. Yeah.
The second question is, how do you do that?
Well, there are multiple steps. We think the first step, which and President Obama was gracious enough to review it and suggest, is that we meet with the President-elect's team, some of the appropriate members of his team, and take them through the recommendations. Because there are steps in here that I think any administration can do immediately, and others will take some time. But there's some things that can be done immediately as far as like establish a collaborative initiative between the private sector and the public sector around things like identity management. So make it harder for them to identify or hack you. And while the government could become the standard for best practice of identity management, they could do that themselves, right? The Internet of Things, how to make those device cameras, sensors, whatever, more secure, so that whether you have a thermostat in your house or a security system with a camera or you use a Fitbit, what have you, they're more secure and their standards exist and security is designed in day one. So you basically, why those two things first? You address the biggest vulnerabilities and how they get access is through us as individuals who are sloppy with our passwords and those sorts of things, or through these devices no one associates as being computers, but they are these days, cameras, etc., thermostats, etc. And then there's the government itself, and there's some roles for government. I'll pass the roles to Tom. I'll talk a little bit about what they could do within the technology of the government, and I think Tom's better to address the kind of the roles in the management system of government, given his experience. But on the technology, first they could do immediately is consolidate their network in the civilian side of government, much like the military is already consolidated, and make it secure so that it's very difficult now to get access into the government systems just through the network itself. Long term, they need to fix their systems, but in the short term, they could just make it harder to get into those systems. And there's a whole series of recommendations around what a new administration should do within the White House, within the agencies, and I'll pass it to
But we have a conflict between Silicon Valley and the White House with respect, and the Justice Department as to, backdoor entry and all kinds of things having to do with security for devices.
Well, the key is, if you think about it just pragmatically, I mean, there's a lot of issues around law enforcement, but pragmatically, the only way to solve this problem is if the technical community, that's a lot of Silicon Valley, and the government,
and Armonk, or wherever else you did.
and Armonk, we're East Coast, you're right, but come together, right, and the big research universities. But that's the only way to solve the problem.
But why hasn't it been done? Why haven't they come together to do this? Because everybody realized we had a problem here between balancing security and privacy and all that.
I mean, I'll speak a little bit to the Silicon Valley side of things, which is the mindset of young companies. It has nothing to do with the individuals in young companies. But in IBM, if you go back to Tom Watson Sr., who founded IBM as the ultimate entrepreneur of his time, with the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, etc., they just want to be left alone. So now we have the technology version of this today. It's these new social media companies, what have you. Their preference when they come to work is leave us alone. I mean, that's their preference, is leave us alone. So when things occur, they really don't want to be burdened by requests from the government for all these informations that they might have in their systems, et cetera, because they want to be left alone. So they start with a bias of just kind of leave me alone, right? And then the other bias is there's been situations to defend them for a second, whereas the information that they've shared for whatever sets of reasons is used in a way that hurts their company's brand. So you could share the information with the appropriate government agencies. We talk about information sharing in the report, but do it in such a way where their brands are protected and it doesn't have an impact to their customers and then therefore their revenue basis. So the point that we're making, it starts with collaboration, Charlie. The key for these incidents when they occur is information sharing, and it's both the network providers as well as the technology companies to share the information in a way where they can do it in a secure way, in a way that protects them, the companies now, from litigation, trial lawyers, etc., but at the same time allows the government and the appropriate authorities to have access to what they need to do their jobs.
And my impression is that large companies are hit all the time in terms of people trying to hack into them.
But they're better at it. I mean, so if you go through the
they're better in terms of defensive measures.
Yes, exactly. If you start, I think the guys who are we did this in our hearings as well. Financial services, as much focus as they have on financial services, it probably is the best. The technology companies, IBM is extremely good, right? But then you put the banks right up there with them. They're very, very good. Our vulnerability is the midsize companies. So, and the midsize companies need to really adopt a standard that was created by NIST in the government for cybersecurity and adopt the same standards that the large guys have already done.
And that's part of what this report's about.
Correct. Very uneven, Charlie. It's very uneven in the United States right now. And what we tried to do is identify some of the coming trends, right? So, for example, Sam referenced the Internet of Things. We're going to have billions of devices connected to the Internet in the foreseeable future here, right? And essentially what's happened is the physical world and the cyber world has converged. And so all these devices that you use every day are going to be points of vulnerability. And so we tried to think about that. That's a vulnerability in the cybersecurity system. And what we call for here is, for the first time, setting standards and trying to get security by design, security at the front end in these devices. And with some simple things, too, for consumers, which is to tell consumers that, in fact, here are standards and that this device has met the standards through a labeling. like an FDA kind of nutritional labeling kind of thing, and a certification organization. When we were growing up, if you had an appliance and it had a UL signal on it, right? By the Underwriters Lab signal on it by an independent organization, you had some confidence that that was a safe device. We don't have anything like that in the software world or the Internet of Things devices world, and we call for a number of steps like that, again, to try to anticipate trends. You asked why it hasn't been done. You have to put in place the incentives to do this, because the incentive of a company, right, is to get its device, its product to market as quickly as possible. And so what we're trying to do here is to put in place some structures and some incentives so that security is thought about. Unlike when the internet first came on, of course, security wasn't the focus, right?
No, it was sharing of documents, scientific documents. That's how it began.
So we're trying to get a number of these big trends right from the start.
Think about the Energy Star. There was a big focus on energy several years ago. There was a star on your electronic devices for energy. Right. Think about this as the Cyberstar. So we'll have a Cyberstar. So when you as a consumer, whether it's a software product or a device or a hardware product, will have this star that at least it competes at some level of a standard of security. And then that would help educate all the people associated with that. The incentives are interesting. We've debated this at length in the commission, because we felt that it should be market-driven approaches, versus heavily regulated, because the stuff moves too fast. And then what is the balance of the right level of incentives to allow this to occur? But I think we could agree, like Tom said, we all agreed, including the private sector and the folks there that were representing the government, all agreed that we need to design in security day one. That's the most important thing. Educate the user and design in day one. Don't have it be an afterthought after the products are already in the marketplace.
It has to get cleaned up later by the IT.
Yeah, exactly, right.
I remember, I did an interview, and he said this during an interview with Larry Ellison, and of Oracle. Basically, he said to me at the time that the Snowden disclosure and question of what is in fact NSA doing, after Snowden, what are they doing, and all things about what would being accessible and phone calls and all of that kind of stuff. Larry said to me at that time, he said, there's so much stuff about individuals out there, and so many people have access to it. It's remarkable what you can find out.
Correct. Yes. But this is why now we say that if you were aware of all that, you would take, I think, precautions to protect yourself like you do with your credit cards. I mean, if you say today, do you protect your credit? Of course you protect your credit cards. Well, it should be the same thing. I mean, and you can say, well, it's harder to use. Well, it's really not. You swipe the credit card or you click it in with the chip. It's not. It can be simplified, but I think the consumer, we have a whole section here, consumer awareness, to educate the consumer to address these kinds of vulnerabilities.
We have a big consumer education piece, and it's also another number of things we talked about here is trying to make these devices so that it is easier for the consumer to act in an appropriate and secure way. Exactly. Right. In fact, one of the R&D priorities we asked for here is to do deeper work on trying to get to devices, right, that are easier to use, right, and are more naturally used by a consumer in a secure way.
Do we have now a significant collaboration with the tech community?
Yes, sure we do, right?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I guess there were incidents along the way, but I really do believe at the end of the day, there's a pretty good working relationship between the tech community and government. It's been especially true, as Tom knows from his old world, my old world. You take DOD or Homeland, National Security. There's been an excellent relationship for years and still continues to be.
Yeah, but there's work to be done, right. And one of the things we call for, as Sam referenced earlier, we call for here, Charlie, is much deeper and faster sharing, right? And to provide more incentives and protections for companies who are concerned about certain vulnerabilities, right? To give them more incentive to share with the government. We also some of the things that are at status right now, for example, is the password. We did our evidence showed this. That if you look at the last 6 years, most of the major breaches were related to some sort of flaw in identity, right? Which is essentially the password,
That's the
right?
biggest one, right?
Yeah, and so there are offerings out there, right, that can protect you. Multi-factor authentication is one, for example, but not being used broadly. And so we call for a process here to get to that, right?
And people stand up at conferences and say, do it now.
Exactly.
Right.
That's exactly right. And so we call for here, for example, is to develop the best authentication technologies that you can, and to start with the government. So, for example, to have the government say, the government has mass consumer and citizen-facing portals, right? IRS, healthcare, the VA, your passport office, DHS, right? And we should set an example by saying that, in fact, if you deal with those portals, those interfaces, you need to have stronger authentication, either multi-factor or some other set of authentication. We should make every federal contractor and employee use it, right? And in that way, try to get that moving through the system, because whoever stood up the conference that you were at was exactly right. This is an incredibly important partial solution, and if you're not doing it now, you're making yourself vulnerable.
So when you travel to Moscow or Beijing, do you use your cell phone? Do you use your computer?
No.
Well, when I was working, they would give me a new one when I returned.
Sure.
So they would scrape the software. And say, give me the hardware device would say they would completely replace the software. And I also knew I was trained never leave the computer in your room. They're going to come in and take your hard files. But I was trained. I lived in Asia almost 35 years ago. I was trained back then not to do these things. So some of us were trained decades ago what not to do in these kinds of.
But when you would return as CEO of IBM, I mean, they would just wipe your computer completely out, and your phone and whatever else you used.
And I have a whole new software load, as they'd say, system that they put in that was cleaned up and secure. Because what they would do is, and it's also, you can do it here, but what they would do, they would basically, when you clicked on your phone, they would put some piece of software into your phone to monitor what was going on. And then what happens is once you come back to work in the United States and you're at work and you're behind your firewall, they're in the system at that point. That's how they do it. Right. That's how they used to do it.
Isn't that what happened at Sony? Did somebody open it up and then?
Yeah, exactly. But it's much more sophisticated today. What Tom was referring to earlier is much more sophisticated. Why you can't find out? It's really hard to find out who it was for some of these incidents, because they'll hijack somebody's server. Well, like for example, I think they actually hijacked a server in what was it, in Japan or something, and went into Sony, even though it came from probably North Korea, North Korea. But they hack a server and they come in that way. So if you track the server trends or the trails, rather, it's hard to find exactly the origination of it. The nation states have gotten very sophisticated.
In most cases, you'd find that if you undertook a number of the steps that we outline in this report,
yes, exactly.
And you actually can significantly enhance your cybersecurity.
Okay, what happens now? You're going to meet with you hope you'll have a meeting with the Trump.
Yeah, we've offered to meet with the president-elect's team.
We've sent them the report. I've sent them the report, and then we hope to hear from them. In fact, they were encouraged over the weekend that they would give us an audience with the appropriate people. So we're waiting to hear.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Tri. Have a good holiday.
Congratulations for the hard work you guys have done and the rest of the commission members.
Well, we had a great team.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.